All right, so wow, this is a beautiful place to share some ideas, isn't it? Thank you again to everybody who's cooking over there, and just everybody who's Tim. Thank you, brother, for inviting us, and everybody who's put in work here. I'm totally new to this space, so I'm just soaking it all up. Um, Miriam and I, my partner, we're visiting from Mexico, and we're originally from Texas, but we've been living in Mexico the last 5 years. And as Elias mentioned, I do a lot of different work. For the last 15 years, I've been an activist, independent journalist. I make documentary films. I've written some books. And we also host an event in Mexico called the People's Reset, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. And pretty much my entire life is oriented. I also make music. I'll be performing later. My entire life is oriented around trying to point to some of the problems in the world, but also more importantly, trying to focus on the solutions. What can we actually do? How can we actually help ourselves? Not just point out the problems and tell everybody how horrible the world is, which is an aspect of our reality, but also more importantly, show people that there are steps and things we can do in our own lives to create a better world. So I was writing down as I was preparing to come up and speak with you guys, how many of you, probably everybody here, are familiar with the phrase, vote with your dollar? You guys know that one? Of course, we all know the idea of being the change you wish to see in the world. You guys are all familiar with phrases like regeneration, regenerative culture, things of that sort. I tried to apply that to every single aspect of my life. So, when we're talking about voting with your dollar, obviously people think in terms of money, or vote with your colones or your peso or whatever. And where do we shop at? Where do we spend our money? Where do we eat, etc.? And how we can think about those things on a deeper level. But what I like to do is really take these concepts and think as holistically as possible. So I often call this holistic activism or holistic anarchism. And we're going to get into that today. We're also going to talk about this strategy that I call exit and build. So again, like I said, I'm going to make a bunch of different references. I might write some of them on there. And overall, though, the talk today is about how we can put some emphasis and some effort into healing our trauma as we try to build this better world. Now, in Costa Rica, there's already a lot of emphasis on the spiritual side of things, the healing. So I feel like much of this crowd has put some effort into that. Has anybody put any time into their shadow work, their healing work, whatever you want to call it, right? Maybe each of us in different ways at different times in our life. And in other circles I speak to, sometimes that's not such a focus. People understand, like, yes, we need to hold crypto, but they haven't done any spiritual work or shadow work, right? Or they're like, permaculture is amazing, but there's other elements. We all have blind spots. We all have areas we can improve and increase our ability to build the world we want to see on. But I really do try to strive to take this holistic perspective. So we're going to talk about how to look at our efforts in as holistic way as possible. We're going to explore this exit and build idea, what that means, and talk about healing our trauma and doing some cool things. But I'd like to share just a little bit of my background briefly. Some of you guys have heard me speak, this story, but I think it's worth sharing. Elias mentioned my website, and my book series is called The Conscious Resistance. I launched this website in 2013 after being an activist in Houston, Texas, where I'm originally from, for about 3 years. I was doing all the activist stuff. This was also around the time, anybody remember the Occupy movement back in the day? So I was active back then in Houston, working with a lot of activists. There was protests, there was marches, there was rallies. It was a really exciting time all around the world, all around the country. And so I had that daily, just, we're going out, we're passing out flyers, passing out DVDs about different documentaries we thought were important, protesting, doing all that sort of stuff. And then also I was developing my sort of spiritual path. And so I would go to meditations and ecstatic dance and all those sort of things. But it was basically a double life for the first couple of years of my experience, because most of the people, at least that I was interacting with on the spiritual side, they didn't seem to be interested in the activist side. And then the activists were most of the activists I knew at that time were very logical, rational people in their perception of the world. Nothing wrong with being logical or rational. But because of that, they were sort of like, spirituality, that's for weird, smelly hippies that hang out in Costa Rica in the jungle. And maybe they were right. So I had this kind of double life for a couple of years where I just did the activist thing and I did the spiritual thing. But in 2013, I had another download that just, one of those nights that you're up watching YouTube videos all night and you just can't stop. I was on one of those journeys, and this phrase, the conscious resistance, was whispered to me. And at that moment, I kind of realized that I could no longer live this double life, that ultimately these these efforts were part of the same effort together. That for me, the conscious resistance, that phrase is just the realization, the understanding, and the recognition that the struggle, the fight for a better, more free, more just world will not come from only confronting the physical institutions of power, whether that's government, corporations, bad people, whatever. Like, that's part of it, right? Like, let's expose the bad things, let's expose the people who are harming the planet and doing destructive things. But that's only one element of it. There's also this whole other component, which is what I call our struggle against our own internal tyrant, which is our doubts, our fears, insecurities, and our limiting beliefs, which can often hold us back and prevent us from being the best versions of ourselves, which I think the creator and the planet is calling for right now, for all of us to step into that best versions of ourselves right now, right? So I had that realization, like, okay, I can't just keep having one life with spiritual friends and one life with activist friends. I needed to bring it together. And the other interesting element about that is every time I would make those efforts, I really would get pushback. I mean, I would be in my spiritual circles and I would say, guys, this weekend there's a protest. The police just shot somebody and we're going to march, or we're going to hold, even if it was more solutions oriented, we're going to go host a Skillshare and teach people how to grow food or whatever it was. Every time I would bring up something that was quote unquote negative, my friends in the spiritual community would plug their ears and say, don't talk about it. You're going to manifest it. Only good vibes here. And they would prefer to keep their heads in the sand. You guys might know some folks like that in the very spiritual conscious community. And that was a big problem, at least for me, because it didn't feel satisfactory. And as I said earlier, I would go to my activist friends and we'd be out in the streets holding our signs or doing whatever we're doing. And I'd say, hey guys, you want to come to this healing retreat this weekend? We're going to be, having a cacao ceremony and sitting, going deep in meditation and chakras. And they would just look at me and call me a weird hippie or something like that. I had to get beyond that and start cultivating not only community, but living in a way that embodied both of those facets together, like bringing those two worlds together. And that's when I launched the Conscious Resistance. And so the website is like the home for my journalism, my podcast, my books, all that sort of stuff. But more than that, it is the way I try to live, like to understand that there are these two realms. It doesn't do us any good, at least from my perspective, to ignore the external physical world. Some people are so tuned in spiritually, consciously, that they're floating in the air all day and they have no foundation, they have no feet on the ground, right? And then vice versa, there are other people who are so stuck in the physical realm and letting that sort of drive their energy and drive their spirit that they're not making time to do that healing work, right? So I really strive to bring those two things together. And the reason I do that is because that's the only reason I'm even alive today with you guys. And I mean that truly, because I got into activism 2009, 2010. That was like my first awakening, paying attention to politics and conspiracies and things of this sort. But I had an awakening a couple years before that. I just turned 40 a couple months ago. So 20 years ago, coming up in November, I was arrested and I went to prison. I was addicted to crystal meth right after high school. Like, I got out of high school, graduated early, went into college, but none of my friends knew that about me. They all thought I was just a crazy kid because I got in fights, I got arrested. I was just dealing with a lot of emotions and things that I didn't know how to handle. And so when I got out and I went into college, you start drinking, and then that turned into pills, and that turned to this thing. Within 2 years, I was homeless, and then I was in prison, and it happened very quickly. Of course, at the time, I didn't have the knowledge I have now to kind of look back and see, like, wow, there was a very obvious path I was on, from being a wounded child from my father, who was a drug addict, who I was visiting in prison at 4 or 5 years old, and then the wounds that came from that eventually evolved from sadness and depression and self-harm as young as 7 years old, suicide attempts before I turned 18. When I became a teenager, that evolved into like anger, and it was like, nope, screw this. I'm never going to let anybody hurt me. My anger is going to keep me strong. And then eventually, like I said, I found drugs and alcohol, and I thought, oh, this is the solution I've been looking for. This is what's making me feel better. Obviously, it was not the case, but I ended up locked up. And when I was locked up, turning 21 behind bars, looking at the calendar, realizing like, I'm not going home for at least a year. Like, that's the earliest I'm going to be getting out of this situation. And that's a situation that I think I was very fortunate to find, as weird as that sounds, because I feel like sometimes in our beautiful, busy, crazy world full of wonderful distractions from sex and drugs and internet and any number of things you can think of, I was forced to face myself. I was stuck in these four walls where I couldn't leave at any point I wanted. I wasn't, you have to accept, like, I can't go to the bathroom in privacy anymore. I can't eat necessarily when I want. I can't go to sleep when I want. I don't leave this institution until these people come and tell me I can leave, And I fought it for the first couple of weeks. But after I had to come to a place of acceptance of like, this is where I'm at, And also that sort of added layer of like, the week I got arrested, my dad was getting out of prison. So I was just like, oh, I'm becoming him. You know, I'm turning into the same thing I've been angry at my whole life. But it was in that space that I really, that sense of powerless, that I actually found my power. And thankfully I had a very wonderful, beautiful grandmother who was one of the biggest spiritual influences in my life. And she started sending me books on Buddhism and on centering prayer and just meditation and all these things that prior to that I had never been open to, because I was one of these kids that was like, you know, F God, fuck spirituality, all this stuff. I didn't want to even be open to anything, because in my mind I was in so much pain. There's no way there could be anything beyond this that would allow me to feel the pain I was feeling, right? But then finally, as a 21-year-old man who thought he knew something about the world, till I'm in prison surrounded by people who've got a lot more experience than I have in different areas, I had to just sit. I had to start meditating every day. And in that place that's filled with fear, it's filled with anger, it all comes back to fear. But there's a lot of machismo. There's a lot of like, we got to boost ourselves up and everybody's got to act hard. At least, you know, of course, the men, you have to put on a sort of a mask. And I just chose to start meditating every day. You know, I could hear the whispers. I was meditating. What the heck's that guy up to? What is that weirdo doing over there? And it was just like, I have to get what I came here for. I started journaling every day. I started doing a lot of the healing work. That was 2005. I ended up getting out. You know, I'm kind of a slow learner. So I did a whole year, and you'd think that would be enough, but I went back and forth for a couple of years. I ended up doing about 19 months behind bars in Texas. And in October 2008, I got out for the final time. I was now a felon in the state of Texas. So I had this sort of extra experience of being judged now. You know, they usually say you have a bullseye on your back when you're a felon, because you can't get a job a lot of places. You can't get rented apartments in certain neighborhoods or houses. And of course, people just hear that and make all kinds of assumptions about you, like what that might mean. So I was getting out October 2008. Again, not really politically aware in any way. I've kind of always been like, yeah, I come from like a punk background. So I was like anti-authority, but not really any philosophical understanding. Just like, yeah, I don't trust the government. But when I got out, Obama was getting elected. I'm a felon now. Very interesting time to kind of be re-emerging into the world. And I was also probably happy for the first time ever in my life. I was 23 years old. And I remember just the feeling of like, whoa, what is this like? What is this feeling inside my heart? Where's the smile coming from? Like, I'm working this crappy job that they would only give me 4 hours a day. I had to take a 2-hour bus both ways to get there. But I remember sometimes I'd get off work and there was just this empty field, and I would just go lay in the field and take naps and watch the sunset. Just weird stuff that I would have never done before, you know, but it was just finally like opening up and I think ready to accept life and to see some good. And so as I'm going through that, I'm like opening up spiritually. The path that I had started in prison with meditation and prayer was continuing. I'm also a felon, so I couldn't get a job many places other than this crappy warehouse job. So I started spending a lot of time at the library just researching and looking for jobs. And I eventually read a book that was all about the drug war. And since I had just got out, you know, related to the drug war, and I'll pause there for a moment, because although I did have a definite drug problem that was related to more kind of psychological and mental issues I was dealing with, I personally don't think people should be locked in cages for their personal choices, even something as horrible with no sort of redeeming factor as crystal meth. I needed help. I didn't need to be thrown in a cage. And I met a lot of really brilliant, great people, older than me, younger than me, who are just wasting away in prisons and who are not being rehabilitated in any kind of way. You know, kids who are like 17 and got caught with pills and they're locked up with like lifelong criminals and things like that, right? So I had to make a personal choice. Prison didn't save me. That system has no redeeming value. I just want to make that clear. That so even though I don't, you know, I would definitely not recommend anybody going down that path. I don't think that was the right action. But I used that time to turn my life around. And so I started reading this book that's all about the drug war, and I'm learning things that I'd never been taught in high school or in college about the origins of the drug war in the United States. Much of it related to racism against black jazz musicians, Chinese migrant workers. They're going to come steal your women if they smoke weed and things like this. And then, of course, the hemp industry being driven out. Just this whole history that it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And it was also the first book I ever took notes on without being assigned to do so. And that was just the beginning of a door opening of like, what else have I not been taught about the world? You know, so I'm coming out of prison. I'm kind of opening up spiritually, and then I'm starting to question the world around me. And then a couple years later, I got into activism and all the stuff I was sharing with you guys. But I share all that just to say that like, that's why my message and what we're going to talk today about the importance of when we exit from these old systems and we want to build new regenerative ones, that we also are taking time to do this internal work, you know, exiting from unhealthy mindsets and limiting beliefs as well, because we can build all the permaculture farms in the world. We can create new currencies and new ways of being and living. But if we don't do that internal work, I absolutely believe that it may take a couple generations, but we will end up cycling back and creating the very same problems that got us here in the first place if we don't address the root causes. And I'm sure you guys understand that. But so that's just a little bit about like why I put that emphasis, why I call my work the conscious resistance. And as I shared, like when I got out of prison, it was this sort of, here's my activist friends, here's my spiritual friends. And eventually that all merged into one thing. And that's just kind of how I try to live my life now, and reminding people the importance of that. In fact, one of our shirts over there is a quote from my book, and it says, "Revolution without healing is a recipe for disaster." You know, and that as we're trying to build these new systems, whether you want to call it a revolution or evolution, whatever words you choose, as we're trying to build new systems, if we don't do that healing, again, it may take a couple generations, but we will cycle back. And I think history shows this, that every person who has thought that they were ready to create something new by declaring themselves the new king or the new person in power, they hadn't done that shadow work. And we see how history turns out when that's the case. You guys with me? Is that making sense? Yeah? Cool. All right. So that's part one of what we're going to go through here. Now let's talk a bit about exit and what I call exit and build. So this concept, I won't go like really deep into it. If you're interested, you can download my books. All of my work is available for free, by the way. We have stuff here for sale, but you can download all my stuff on my website. I try to put as much free stuff out as possible for anybody who wants to access it. And it's in Spanish as well if you want to share it with friends. But the philosophy that inspired me is called agorism. And basically agorism was this, it was discovered or created by this activist from the United States. He's a Canadian who was in the US. And he was active in like the 1960s, 70s student movements, which was, of course, a very big time of change all around the world. And his analysis, which I agree with, was that real lasting change won't come from politics, and it won't come from violence, you know, violently forcing our way and trying to like make people be free or make them live in a regenerative lifestyle or whatever it may be. And it's definitely not going to come from apathy, from just throwing our hands up and giving up and, you know, saying screw it. Instead, he started to research, like, if it's not going to come through politics, if it's not going to come through violence or just doing nothing, then what are other avenues to change? And he was very inspired by the agora, the Greek word for marketplace in ancient Greece. And it's kind of like this, a place where we could come together and discuss ideas, have healthy debates, exchange food and goods and services. And he kind of held that up as like an ideal that we might be able to reach sometime in the future. Like, how could we get to this place where people could be as free as possible while also respecting the sovereignty of each individual? And I'll mention that too, that for me, one of the highest ideals that I hold is sovereignty of the individual, self-ownership, individual liberty, because I believe that if each of us recognize that for ourselves and for other people, when you really take that idea, like if I say like I own myself and I'm a free, beautiful, powerful person, but then I also extend that to you and I recognize that you are a free, powerful, beautiful person as well. Well, the implications of that are that it's wrong, immoral, unethical, impractical for me to force my way on you, right? To say, well, I think I know the best way to live, so I'm going to come force you to live that way because that's, you know, that's going to make things better. But then I'm violating his self-ownership or her self-ownership, right? So that kind of is a highest ideal that I hold. Also, to take that a little further and maybe get in some touchy subjects, if you take that concept even further, if it's wrong for me to force him or her to do something, it's also wrong to say, I'm going to go vote and I'm not going to force somebody to do it, but the government's going to force you to do it. So this is why I consider myself to be an anarchist, that I don't think using the violence or the force of government to achieve our goals is the best way. And Samuel Konkin, who's the founder of agorism, he spent his life promoting these ideas. And actually, in some ways, he predicted Bitcoin and predicted a lot of the technological developments we're seeing. He knew that, you know, he's alive in the 70s, 80s. He's like a super nerd, sci-fi. He died, unfortunately, in 2004 because he didn't understand the importance of also taking care of your health. And he didn't take care of himself very well. And he died before his ideas have now kind of flourished. And even people who've never heard of agorism, more and more people are talking about building parallel economies or parallel systems, alternative systems. This was really the root of his idea. If we're not going to achieve change through politics, if we're not going to achieve change through violence or through apathy, then what else are we left with? What he was inspired by is he started to look in like the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as Peru in the 70s and other areas where he could see that every time governments or the state got more aggressive, the people would naturally kind of pull back. And there would be this underground alternative, or what he called a counter economy outside of the state. And his idea was essentially that if each of us were to take our power, our time, our money, and our energy away from these old failing systems, whether that's government, corporations, etc., and instead put our energy into building these new counter economies. He focused mainly on finance. I try to take it again more holistically. Then with time, we would see those systems continue to fail, and we would see the creation of new parallel systems. And it really, what it basically comes down to is instead of trying to change the system from within, we compete with the system directly. You know, we don't say we're going to play their game. We just say, all right, we're going to build our own things, and we're going to focus our energy on what we want to see in the world. And with time, and I do believe this is a generational change. I don't think this is going to happen overnight. This is why I'm trying to spend as much of my time in life as possible on this. I don't know if the ideas that I'm working on and that many of us, I think, are working on, if we will see the fruits of our labor in our lifetime. But I do know that the coming generations, which, by the way, are 100% depending on us, they will see the fruits of our labor. Those are the ones that really matter, right? So that was essentially Konkin's idea, and we could get deeper into that. But I was very inspired by his ideas when I first heard about them in 2011. As I said, I was getting into activism. I was part of the Occupy movement, and then part of the End the Fed movement, where people were talking about central banks and the problems related to the financial collapse. And at first we were just protesting, we're just protesting, yelling at buildings. You guys ever do that? Yell at buildings, thinking it's going to change the world? Yell at buildings, like hold signs and scream at the buildings when nobody's even there sometimes. But yeah, it feels good to get your voice out. But after a while, you got to start asking, like, well, how are we actually going to get this changed? And if we don't like this system, what do we actually do? And then it started for me in 2011. I heard a friend give a speech and said something to the effect of, like, if you want to see the Federal Reserve System end, then we need to stop using it. And at that time, people were talking about like little silver coins or gold backs or making our own paper currency or barter. And then, of course, Bitcoin started to become popular. I got into Bitcoin in 2012, and my first transaction was in 2013. Not as an effort to get rich, but for me, because I understood the original ethic, which was very much an anarchist ethic inside Bitcoin. It has changed a lot now, but the original ethic was like, this is a way to defeat the central banks. This is a way to get around government and to get around taxes and to build something new. So that was inspiring to me. It's like, that's agorism in action. We're building a parallel system outside of their hands. And so I've just run with these ideas over the last 15 years. And I happened to kind of wake up the same year. I was supposed to start filing taxes as an adult, so I never did. So I don't pay taxes. And I don't really think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's, again, immoral for them to take things involuntarily from us. And instead, I try to, once again, vote with my dollar. Sometimes people hear that idea of like not paying taxes, like, oh, you must be some selfish capitalist asshole that doesn't care about the community. What I do is instead, I serve every day, I vote every day, and I pay my taxes every day by the way I live, by the way I contribute to my community. And I think that's something a little bit more realistic than just being extorted and thinking you're doing something sort of glamorous. So I pulled out of that system, and I haven't used the bank since 2008. And as I mentioned, I'm also a felon, so this makes things kind of difficult. But these ideas came to my life at the perfect time. And so over the years, I've adapted them, and I tried to modernize them because, as I said, Konkin died 2004. So he wrote one and a half book, and that was kind of it. And he also is very nerdy and kind of writes in a very dry way that I don't think is very accessible for most people. So I've taken those ideas and I put them into my books. And I have sort of taken that and I call it exit and build. So instead of just focusing on the economy like he did, we think holistically. So the finance aspect is one part of it, right? People are really hot on Bitcoin. I really like Monero. Is anybody into Monero? No Monero. If you care about privacy, you should check out Monero. But that's, again, just one piece of that. So we don't want to be a part of the legacy banking system, the fractional reserve, central bank, all the problems, debt-based. We understand the issues with that. So we want to support something alternative, Bitcoin, Monero, etc. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. We should also, I believe, be thinking about our food, which obviously in a place like Costa Rica, many of you are. Where is our food coming from? What are the systems that it takes to get the food to us? And this is why, of course, we focus more on growing our own food as possible, or at least supporting the local farmers and markets who are growing their food. Especially, like, is anybody just visiting Costa Rica going to go back to a city or something eventually? Like a place where food isn't just as abundant? So a couple people here, maybe some of you made this your home. And let's just say for the average person in the world, that's their situation, right? They're not growing their food. They're going to the big box grocery stores. And there's many reasons to not be dependent on the system. One of them I'll just mention, besides the fact that we know these are unsustainable, these are wasteful, these are destructive systems that involve like trucking food from thousands of miles away. We need more food, local food production and distribution systems is kind of what I fight for. But also during what I call COVID 1984. Anybody? We learned that there's problems with being dependent on grocery stores because, and again, goes back to self-ownership. So whatever your beliefs are, to me, you should have the right to choose. We saw that grocery stores started requiring people to wear masks or to show proof of vaccination and stuff like that. Again, whatever you want to do, but people should have a right to choose. That was an eye-opener for a lot of people of maybe I don't want to be dependent on this big box store, then maybe I need to find a local community garden or a community farm or a CSA or some way that I can supplement my income so I'm not dependent on these big corporations. So food, finances, I also think education is a big part of this, whether we're talking about educating the young ones here or just educating ourselves as adults. The mainstream education systems, this applies here as well as in the United States and most of the Western world, are indoctrination centers. They were built that way on purpose. Just throw out this. If you want to learn more, I have a 17-part documentary series called thepyramidofpower.net. You can go dive deep into it. But look up the first episode on big education and learn more about the history of the education systems and the people behind them. And their goals were not to create critical thinkers. Their goals were to create obedient worker bees and people who know how to do simple tasks, not to ask questions, not to question authority. And we could get further into various levels of propaganda. But at the end of the day, there's a really cool quote, and I don't know it verbatim right now, but a quote from Malcolm X that's like, you should never let your enemy educate your children. That's just like a step in the wrong direction to let your children, the future generations. And for me, as well as I probably think most of you here, is anybody else here fighting for the coming 7 generations and beyond? Because what we allow to go into their brains and for them to be fed, both physically and mentally, is going to shape the rest of their life. And if you really think about that, like, just to pause there for a moment, they send us to, like, is anybody else here a product of public education? Yeah. And we survived through that, or a survivor, some people say it. And I say that because realistically, like, describing all that trauma I was going through earlier, I probably wouldn't have made it through if it wasn't for 2 teachers who actually gave a shit and were like, could see that I was struggling and would kind of let me know, like, hey, Derrick, if you need somewhere to go, just come visit my class. If you need to get away, like, without them, I don't know what I would have done. But something inside me, and I think many of us understood intrinsically that these systems were not, that they're just one size fits all, right? Maybe they work for some people and that's fine. But the idea that our beautiful minds can just be put in a little box and we're all going to learn the same is just ridiculous, And so think about that you're sending the kids to these places from, depending on the country, 5 to 6 to 17 to 18, at this most impressionable years of their life for 7 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. They're spending more time with your kids than you are, and they're soaking up these ideas and these lessons. So I'm a big supporter in like the unschooling, deschooling, homeschooling movement, but being a realist as well, I have 2 brothers and sisters who are working class people with 3 kids each. They don't feel like they can afford to do it. I think it could be possible if they wanted to make the effort, but there's a lot of people in that situation. So I encourage them to just be even more involved with their kids' lives, like knowing what they are teaching them and teaching them those critical thinking skills, teaching them to ask questions. If you're not getting kicked out of a couple classrooms, you're not asking enough questions. I got kicked out of plenty of Sunday schools and other, classrooms for asking too many questions. And again, that's like, it sent a message to me. Okay, they don't want me to think, they just want me to regurgitate what they're telling me. I'm not allowed to say, hey, well, this doesn't make sense to me. What about this other viewpoint? So there's a lot of different problems in those systems. Thankfully, though, we have the internet, and the internet really is, obviously, there's double-edged sword there, but it gives us this ability to educate ourselves as adults and children for those who use it. It's a tool, right? So you can either just scroll TikTok and Instagram all day and like destroy your attention span, or you can learn about the world and you can educate yourself from multiple different sources and then come to your own conclusions. I didn't go to journalism school. I came from an activist background, then got into journalism, started to take it really seriously. And then later I went back and used websites like EDX and others that teach you, there's free courses available online. And again, doesn't mean there's not propaganda in there and you shouldn't, kind of keep your critical thinking cap on. But I was able to educate myself and learn tools and skills that I didn't gain elsewhere, and to do it at my own pace, in many cases for free. Sometimes I chose to pay because it's worth gaining those skills. But my point here is we have this ability now to exit from these different systems and to support new ones. So to elaborate a little further on the exit and build idea, as I said, Konkin talks about creating alternative systems. I talk about exiting from systems, what I often call slavery systems, because I do believe in the long term, that's where they're going to lead to, slavery of the mind and the body and the spirit. And if you recognize that there's a system you're participating in or that you're connected to that is not aligned with your values and your principles, then take steps to try to get away from that, and then either build new systems or support those who are building those new systems, right? Like many of us here, we're not necessarily crypto coders or software engineers or anything like that. So we might not be the ones to build the technological tools we need, but we can support those who are, right? And we might not be permaculturists, but we can work with those who are, and we can gain the skills and learn from them. So that's really what exit and build comes from, is exiting from systems that don't align with your values, and then building or supporting new systems that do. There's another component that I'll just mention briefly, and that is what I've been describing so far as education, money, and food, is the exit and build idea applied to kind of systems, looking in whole systems. And does anybody understand the meaning of the word holistic? Like truly understand it, not just in this kind of vague spiritual way that we all throw around, but like, does anybody know what that means?
Well,
or what do you think it means? Let's throw that out.
Yeah, I guess it could have like many different definitions, but I like to think of it of seeing many dimensions of the same thing. There are many ways, many frameworks to see it. Like one is like Eco-Village design whole system framework. So it talks about 4 dimensions, like the social, economic, ecological, and spiritual. Or
so having a big picture view of everything.
That's one.
Do you have one? Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, for me it's also being really aligned, stepping back from your ego.
Sure.
And, the person you're here.
Yeah.
But doing without even knowing what you receive and what you just feel what is right, and you don't understand even why. Maybe.
I like that. Anybody else?
I would say it's looking at all the layers that are involved in the decision making.
Great.
Basically, looking at all that is involved in that.
Perfect. So the interesting thing about this word, like a lot of words in our various communities, they get sort of watered down. So then you end up with holistic dog food and holistic, whatever, every random thing. And it's a marketing thing. They realize there's a certain personality type, which is probably all of us, that sees holistic like, oh, I want that one. Let me grab that one from the store.
I want to say something I think very cool, like thinking about relating that everything is like systems, and viewing the relation between systems.
Exactly.
Always having this picture that there is relations going on and many systems.
That's exactly what it is. So holistic, the root word there, what it really means is dealing in whole systems, right? So holistic, it's talking about whole systems there, and we could talk about many different disciplines. But for example, like if you're studying environmental science, and if you're just looking at it from maybe one system, you're studying the waterways or you're studying the animals. But if you take a holistic perspective, you're looking at how those different systems interrelate and connect with each other. That's the kind of way I try to approach my activism. That's why I'm talking about with exit and build. Yeah, let's talk about the farming and then the food, because that's obviously essential to life. Let's talk about crypto or alternative currencies of whatever kind, but also let's see how these different systems relate to each other and recognize that there's more than just one. And also the other thing is, each of us have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different goals, resources, etc. And so the systems that we are kind of drawn to or interested in are going to be different between each of us, right? So I'm focusing on 5 things now, talking about finance, talking about food, education. We're going to talk about technology in a moment, and then we're going to get on talking about the internal side. But I encourage each of you, later on, whenever you have time, to sit down and just do a little bit of journaling and thinking about the different systems, both on the international, worldwide level, but also just in your personal life that you care about. Like different systems that maybe you feel like you're not necessarily where you want to be, right? Like maybe, for example, as we're sitting here talking, like I could say, I don't grow 100% of my food right now at the current moment. We supplement from local markets. We have land. We're working in that direction. So I can see where the goal is at over here. And I know I'm taking the steps and I have a plan to get there, but I'm not there right now, right? But at least if we each approach it in that conscious way, if we look at these whole systems and we see this is where my present situation is, like let's imagine finance. For many people, they're like, I got student debt, I got credit card debt, I just whatever, I'm living check to check, things like that, right? So you're not where your ideal situation is. But over here, you're like, I'd like to have some money put away. I'd like to, pay off all that debt. I'd like to be able to travel freely, these sort of things. They're out of your reach right now at the moment, but you can see what the goal is. And it's as silly and simple as it sounds. We have to bring it down to as basic level as possible. How do you get to there? you got to make an action plan, whether that's a 1 week action plan, a 6 month, a 1 year. Set the bigger goal and then start thinking about it on a practical level. How do you get there day to day? Okay, well, I can't erase my credit card debt overnight, but maybe if I put in some extra hours at work, and it's going to be a tough 6 months or a year, but I will get there, right? I can start taking these concrete steps. Or I would like to grow 60% of my food, but right now I've never planted a seed in the ground. I don't know anything about permaculture, never even been to a garden, right? Well, then you get online and search and you find that there's a local community garden. Go volunteer once a weekend, put a couple hours in. Right now, if you did that every weekend for 1 month, you just gained 8 hours of new knowledge. If you just put 2 hours on the weekend, right? So bit by bit, over time, you are moving towards that goal. And again, applying this kind of holistically, you will get to those goals you're trying to get. You will exit from the systems that you don't want to be a part of because either they're unsustainable, they're not aligned with your values, they're headed in bad directions, etc. And you will get to the places by trying to support those who are already doing the things you'd like to do. I mean, we got to learn from people. This is all I've tried to do, is learn from people who are kind of a little bit further ahead on the path I'd like to be, right? Be inspired by those people and collaborating with them and learning from them. Let's talk about technology for a moment. Yep.
Sorry, I'm like.
No, you're cool.
I would love to, if you can just make the connection between what is this 7 generations thing and how it relates with the human trauma.
Sure. Can I bring it back? I'm going to be ending that after this one. Perfect. I got the note here. Thank you. So let's talk about technology for a moment, and then we will wrap up on the trauma side of it, which I think is kind of the thing that holds it all together. So technology for me is it's a tool, right? We all use technology in different ways. As a journalist, and especially as kind of like a semi-nomadic journalist, I'm grateful for the technology that allows me to be in Costa Rica and continue to write articles and continue to get paid and things of that, right? Or to put out video reports and stuff like that. But there's also many, many downsides to technology. My background journalistically, and the book that I'm kind of quoting from and sharing with you guys, is called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State. I wrote it in 2019, and we released it 1 month before COVID came to give us the gift that it was. And I say it that way because it really inspired many people to actually take steps and like, hey, maybe I need to get my shit together now because the world's going crazy. But in that book, I talk about these ideas and how we need to build holistically, build parallel systems. But more specifically, I focus on the dangers of technology. Again, caveat, it's a double-edged sword. There are benefits, obviously, but just to focus on the problems for a moment. I've been warning about the problems associated with digital IDs, social credit scores, facial recognition cameras since at least 2016, 2017, but I wrote it in my book in 2019 because my background as an activist really comes from that area. And just really briefly, the reason that is because in 2014, when I was still an activist in Houston, a Houston police officer leaked pictures to me showing that the police department was having a training session with my face on the wall. And I was told by this police officer that I had an active criminal intelligence officer assigned to me. So I'm like riding my bike around Houston. I guess there's a cop following me around or something. But what it really did, it made me think, like, okay, that's kind of scary. But if I'm under surveillance, what does that even mean? What does that really look like, right? So I started diving deep into Stingray surveillance, which is basically a cell phone. They call them cell site simulators. They can grab everything out of your phone, pictures, text, images, cell site simulators, facial recognition cameras, automatic license plate readers, heat detection technology. I just went deep into all this sort of stuff. And I learned from people who are much more experienced than me. And as far back as 2017, there have been digital rights activists, attorneys, lawyers, and AI coders warning about these things, warning about the rise of facial recognition cameras and the way that governments can use these to basically create a completely interactive system that can track you from everywhere you go. And of course, as we saw during COVID-1984, those things can be used against you. Eventually, you can get to a place where what you post on the internet can be used against you. Your accounts can be shut down. In fact, just a couple of months ago, right before our event in Mexico, I was debanked, and then Miriam was debanked. And for those who use Wise, I got debanked by Wise. They completely turned off all my account, held like $5,000 of ours on hostage because I didn't want to give them tax information or bank. I don't even have a bank, so I was like, I don't have that, I don't have that. Long story short is just that they can use these different systems. The more interconnected they are, they can be turned against us. And many people saw that during COVID. If you were a person who wasn't very vocal during COVID, you might not have noticed this, but a lot of people, including myself, my entire YouTube channel of 70,000 subscribers and 10 years of work was deleted October 2020 because Miriam told me about a doctor in China who was doing intravenous vitamin C treatments for COVID, and I interviewed him, and apparently that went against the World Health Organization policy, and I was deleted off YouTube. So when it gets more connected like that, the opportunities for us to be shut out of these systems becomes greater. And that's why my message is really like, how about we don't be dependent on these systems, and how about we strive to create independence from them as much as possible? So technology is a double-edged sword. There's a lot of ways it can be used against us. I'm sure you're all aware, if you know who Edward Snowden is and you know about just the various ways governments can do that. And don't fool yourself in thinking because the Costa Rican government cares about the environment that they don't have the same tools. So learning to use technology in a way that can actually benefit us and empower us is absolutely important. I will throw out a couple websites for those who want to learn more about this. One of them is called nomoregoogle.com. How many people here in their freedom events, conscious spaces are currently using Google Docs, Gmail, Zoom, etc.? No, this is not a shame question, just like, let's be real, right? Okay, so look around, like half of us, most of the room, right? There are better solutions out there. There are better tools. One of the ones that so first of all, nomoregoogle.com, I'm not paid by any of these websites. These are just resources I use. It's just a cool list of like calendar, everything that you do with Google, and it'll show you different alternatives that exist. I personally use CryptPad, CRYPT pad.fr, and it's open source. You can actually host your own nodes, host your own instances of this, and it does everything that you do. You can do sheets, you can do docs, you can do forms, all that without supporting a corporation, which, does anybody remember back in the day, Google's motto used to be "Don't be evil." And at one point they decided that didn't apply to their business model anymore, so they got rid of that. Also, if you want to look up the Project Maven, the Dragonfly project, these are all projects that Google's involved in. They're using their AI to help certain governments use drop drone bombs more efficiently, things like this. These are just reasons that for me personally, I don't want to support these companies. Not to mention getting into the surveillance and things like that, right? So again, voting with our dollar, why would I continue to use Google and these other big corporations? Like, has anybody heard about the suicide nets outside of the Apple factories? You guys familiar with that? Like that, there's so many people who, the people who are working in the Apple factories, building the iPhones and et cetera, that they literally are working, they pretty much live there, and they work these long shifts that many of them have jumped out the windows to kill themselves, that eventually Apple had to install suicide nets around the buildings. So these are like, vote with our dollar, right? Well, we have to think about these tools that we're using and what we're supporting by doing them. And of course, we can get deeper into the conversation about like lithium mining, and there's no perfect answer. I don't know, right? It's a qualm I constantly have. Like, am I deluding myself to think by using my laptop that has this lithium mine that may have been stripped out of the Amazon rainforest and harmed some tribe, but I'm doing good things with it, I promise. But it'd be hard to maybe tell that tribe to their face, like, I promise, like, I'm doing good things with this. I don't know. It's not a perfect situation, and we have to acknowledge that. But at the very least, we can strive to, again, there's the perfect ideal. We're not there, but we can take steps to lessen our dependence on these systems, and also make sure we're at least becoming less and less dependent on these immoral systems that are doing things that I don't think any of us really want to support. And we don't even need to get into Gaza of how many of the tech companies are involved with supporting things that are going on over there, but it's the facts. So those are the reasons why we wouldn't want to use them. So you want to go to nomoregoogle.com, start looking up some alternatives. Check out cryptpad.fr. Check out privacytools.io. That's just another resource that has similar kind of tools you can look up. privacytools.io, nomoregoogle.com. And one of our friends who actually has a company I'll talk about in a moment, he runs a website called takebackourtech.org. His name's Hakeem Anwar, and he does just a bunch of really great free webinars and just walkthroughs to show you how to get off of Microsoft and onto Linux, or how to be more aware of what surveillance is possible on your phone. And he actually has a company called Above Phone. They sell de-Googled phones and now laptops, where for those, anybody can learn how to de-Google a phone. It's, the knowledge is out there, but if you don't want to, or you don't know how to, you don't want to make the effort, they've made it easy where you can just go ahead and buy a phone, and a few people here have the phones and use them. And these phones are loaded with all the alternative apps that you've never heard of that do the same things you're already currently doing. So instead of being dependent on Google knowing your location and telling you when to take a left and when to take a right, there's organic maps, there's Magic Earth, there's alternatives to all these things. If you want to watch YouTube videos, there's an app called NewPipe, which allows you to access YouTube, watch everything you want on there without an account, without logging in, and you can actually download it, videos or MP3s. What's the podcasting one, baby? There's also Miriam has the phone, so the Antenna Pod. So there's this other, and these are all open source apps that if you wanted to, you could still put them on your phones, but of course your phone will still have some of the other surveillance aspects. But Antenna Pod I'm just throwing out some of these examples of how we realistically use it. She likes to listen to a lot of podcasts, and she doesn't want a Spotify account or an Apple account or whatever. You can just go to AntennaPod, you search, like you could find my podcast, search The Conscious Resistance, and you can start following, and you can download all of them. So if you're traveling and you don't have internet access, you have all that stuff there. Because another part of this whole control grid is getting us away from ownership, which I think in many of our communities we have looked at as a very bad thing. Obviously, I think it's a positive thing to sort of look at stewarding the earth. But I do think there's something to be said for being able to own things that especially if you've created with your own hands or contributed to it. Instead, now we went from like owning CDs or DVDs to just paying these giant corporations every month to stream stuff, and they can take shit off whenever they want. They can change it, and of course, during COVID, a lot of these companies were also censoring podcasts and taking things down. Instead, you can directly have that content downloaded to your device. You can save it on a hard drive, whatever it is. I'm really big on that, like stepping away from the subscription model for everything, because that's just another way to control and limit what we have access to. Like if you're all on Netflix and Hulu and these other things, for one, there's so many free ways to watch these stuff on the internet that you don't have to pay any money if you don't want to. But they also can decide month to month what shows, what movies they can take off, and then all of a sudden, next thing, your favorite movie is gone, and you don't actually own a physical copy of it. You don't have it, right? So becoming less dependent on those systems in a number of ways is really important. But the above phone is definitely something that I recommend at least checking out. Again, it won't necessarily be for everybody. So if you're just interested in de-Googling your phone, there's plenty of guides out there. In fact, I think Hakeem and them offer their own guide if you want to just do it yourself. Because their goal is, obviously they're a company, but their goal is to try to get these ideas out there. And as I said earlier, I'm not a technologist. I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a coder. I just do this. I speak a lot and I share ideas. So whenever I meet somebody like him, I want to like shout it from the rooftops, like, hey guys, there actually are tools here. Because the technology piece is a really hard one. Because if we were to go to any local electronics store, you're not going to find the above phone. You're going to find Microsoft, Google, Apple, because they've monopolized the market, and that's all people think there are. But there's also another company called Start9. They also make laptops, and I don't think they make phones, but mainly laptops. Again, I'm not like working with any of these companies. They're people doing good work that I can't do. But that's another way to sort of think holistically. We think about the food, the money, the education, technology, and the way that we're using these things. Are we voting with our dollar? Are we really being the change we wish to see in the world? Or are we kind of putting on that costume every now and then and thinking we're doing that? And again, we're in an imperfect situation, so this isn't a judgment on any of us. I'm not claiming to be perfect here in any way. It's a step-by-step process. In my book, I kind of call them half measures of like for example, the financial situation. Like let's say I want to hold some crypto and I want to be debt-free and all this stuff, but right now all my money's in a big bank. In fact, my money's not me, but theoretically, my money's in JP Morgan Chase, and JP Morgan Chase was the bank that helped Jeffrey Epstein launder his money for his abuse victims. So why would we want to put your money in there? I don't know. Bank of America, they robbed the American people in 2008 and people around the world. Why would we want to let them hold our money? So then you take a first step, which is learning about a local credit union or a smaller local bank. You take your money from the big bank and you put it in something local. Okay, so you took a step in the right direction, right? And then you also all right, I'm gonna go take an online crypto course and learn a little bit about that and see if it's right for me. Or I'm gonna, like in Mexico, there's a local currency that's growing around the country called the tumen, and it's a physical currency. It's not digital or anything like that. Whatever it is, you start taking steps towards learning these things. It's not gonna happen overnight, but at least if you have this plan, you can kind of start seeing that you're making progress. You're exiting from those systems that don't align with your values, and you're building or supporting those who are building those alternatives. And then before we talk about the trauma and kind of bring it home here, one other component of exit and build is about physical location. And I have a feeling some of you guys might relate to this. During COVID 1984, some places went batshit crazy. And some of us decided, I'm going to move one town over or one state over or a completely different country. Did anybody do that? Anybody decide or even after COVID, just whatever. Did you decide to move to a place that you feel is more aligned with your values and the vision that you have for your life, right? That's exit and build. So there's the sort of systems, holistic component we're talking about, but there's also physical location. The fact of the matter is not all places are equal. Sometimes as an activist, you might be like, no, in the book, I call it hold down the fort. So you're going to hold down the fort. You're like, I need to be, and sometimes you do, we can't all just move to one location and watch the rest of the world go crazy. Sometimes you might feel called to say, this is where I'm from. I'm going to be the light here, and I'm going to build, and I'm going to do that hard, difficult work. Other times you might say, you know what, look at them over there in that town over there, or 2 towns over, or this country over there. They've already got so much going there. I can contribute my skills. So I'm going to come join what they're doing and I'm going to build there, right? So exit and build can be physical location as well as systems design. Now, to bring it back to the trauma, for those who were here earlier, and I shared my story about going to prison and just addiction and struggling with all that stuff. This, I think, it's really just the ultimate piece. Like, I'm not here to tell you what modality is right or the one way or the only way, because I think that's bullshit. I think anybody who's telling you there's only one way to healing or one way to the divine or to creation is not correct. So you need to decide what that works for you. I shared a couple tips. Meditation was big for me. Creative visualization, journaling. I think I probably wouldn't have made it through without journaling, without writing down all the crazy thoughts up here and getting them down and being able to physically look at them and kind of then process them. So I encourage you to start journaling your thoughts down. I encourage you to start writing your ideas and your thoughts out and being able to open up a notebook and look at them. And whatever other things call to you, you will know better than I will what feels right to you. All I know is that if we don't do that important work, we won't build the better world for the coming generations, the 7 generations. So this is a principle that all of our indigenous communities, I'm originally from Texas, and part of my family, my last name is Broze, part of my family is from the Czech Republic, like generations back. And then the other part of my family is native to Texas, and then a couple generations back from northern Mexico. And as I've got into reconnecting to my indigenous ways and going to Sundance and going to ceremony, we're taught to think of the 7 generations and beyond, right? So we have our children, their children, grandchildren, right? The people that we see, a couple generations, but you have to think even further than that. The people who you are never going to meet, right? What kind of world are they going to be born into? And I've come to the realization that the world they're going to be born into is 100% without a doubt dependent on what we do right now or we don't do. If we choose to take action, whatever problems we're seeing in the world, if we choose to take action on them and focus on the building of systems that actually reflect our values, then there's a chance humanity thrives into the future. If we choose not to, and we choose to give into our doubts, our fears, our insecurities, like I hear all the time when I tell people we're building an eco-village in Mexico, they're like, oh, you really think the government's just going to let you do that? You think they're just going to let you go live free? Yeah, what happens when, and they'll name any number of potential bad scenarios, right? They're stuck in this kind of poverty fear mindset. And instead of thinking of the possibilities of what can happen, their first thought is what can go wrong. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have those conversations and think about what could go wrong, but I'm not going to allow the fear of what can go wrong prevent me from taking action, right? And I don't think any of us should. So, because we have the 7 generations that are ahead of us that are dependent, the ones that are not even born yet. They're not even like a thought in their future parents' mind yet. Their parents aren't even born yet, right? But what we create now, the way we live our lives, the way we inspire and activate other people, the way we lead by example, that is going to shape the world that they are born into. And then also, I like to take the 7 generations principle and extend it backwards as well. Because right now, I know we have people here from different countries on this planet, and we all have different skin tones and ethnicities and differences. But no matter what our differences, every single one of our ancestors had to go through blood, sweat, and tears to get us here right now in this moment, to be living, breathing, alive, and experiencing this present moment. And I know that my ancestors are at my back, that they're with me, that they're walking with me. And I prayed to them and I asked them for guidance. I prayed to them this morning, sitting on a rock, meditating at Elias's place before this big day here to make sure that I could share the words that you guys need to hear, and ask them to be with me and just to feel their presence. And that goes back 7 generations and beyond. They're with us, and they had to go through so much just to make sure we could be here and all the beauty that we have today. If we don't act, I believe we're failing them as well. We're not only failing the 7 generations coming ahead, but we're failing those who had to work so hard to get us here. So my goal, my mission, and my request, my humble request to each of you is to get activated. It's not enough to be awake, to be aware, to be conscious. What does it matter if we don't do anything with that knowledge? What does it matter if we don't actually live it, if we don't inspire other people to live in these ways, and if we're not actually showing people what an embodied, empowered person, not a perfect person, but a person that's striving to get to that better place that they know is possible and is living it every day and is thinking holistically about it. That's what I'm working towards, guys, and I hope you guys will join me on that effort. I appreciate your time. I'm going to just throw out 3 websites real quick because I didn't mention any of it. But if you're interested in the community that Miriam and I are building in Mexico, it's called The Conscious Agora, theconsciousagora.com. Also, if you are looking, there's a few people here who are involved and interested in expanding the Freedom Cell network in Costa Rica. It's a project that I helped start years ago. The website's freedomcells.org, like cells, like the cells in your body. Each of them is unique and powerful, but together they're part of a larger ecosystem, freedomcells.org. And we also host an event every January in Mexico. It's like hundreds of people from around the world, 5 days, solutions focused. It's called the People's Reset, thepeoplesreset.org. And last thing, guys, I like to share a positive affirmation. This is one I've been doing for years. It's on our shirt. It helped me through my tough times when I was locked up. If you feel inclined, please repeat after me. I am powerful.
I am powerful.
I am beautiful.
I am beautiful.
I am free.
I am free.
Thank you, guys.
Amazing. Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you, brother.
Feeling so much pain.